Right now, we've got a really interesting topic. Does working from home reduce your emissions? We often assume that working from home is a zero carbon commute. And obviously, there's no tailpipe emissions, but it'd be really good to dig into this. And we've got an expert. We've got Ellie Monks. She's the Senior Climate Analyst at Green Element. And she works to equip organizations to work towards a sustainable future. Ellie, we're delighted to have you. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. And I guess just starting, it'd be good to have a bit of personal context as to when I started Green Element just over 3 years ago, towards the latter end of 2020. I actually joined fully remotely for my first 6 months. So never commuted into my office space, never used energy within my office space. So really my impact lay in my home and what energy I was consuming in my home. So a few of us got our heads together and really sort of dug into the research and developed our own methodology for capturing home working emissions. And I'll be taking you through our findings of all the data we've collated so far. So next slide, please. And I guess first off, taking a step back and seeing where home working emissions fit into your reporting. We know there's a separate greenhouse gas protocol specific for commuting, which is category 7. So as an organization, if you want to set real science-based net zero targets and have them validated, you need to include commuting within your inventory. But actually, within the greenhouse gas protocol, you can see the quote on the slide here, working from home emissions or teleworking emissions are actually optional. So they're not necessary to be disclosed to set net zero targets. But as sort of mentioned, when I sort of first joined, my impact was purely at home. And, you know, business as usual in 2019, a lot of people may have been commuting into the office and having that as the main sort of area where your impact lay. So it's really important to consider all areas and take that wider picture. And as you can see from the balancing scales there, consider all 3 impacts of your working. That's your commuting, that's your office consumption, and that's your at-home energy consumption. Next slide, please. And again, sort of going back to when we started doing the research, there was no sort of clear standard or method for calculating home working emissions back when we had a look at it in 2020, simply because home working was a new sort of phenomena coming out and in the wake of COVID and not sort of considered or measured before for organizations. And a lot of the existing standards or those that came out in the subsequent years were looking at the average method approach, which is sort of looking at the average domestic energy consumption per region, per country, and per household as well, and assigning those values to one person working from home in one day. But we sort of take the more bottom-up approach, which is the next 2 methods, and really delve into looking at people on the individual basis and asking about people's individual behaviors whilst working from home. And this can cover anything to how many devices you're using, whether you're using a laptop, a monitor, lighting to work your home space, whether that lighting's LED, right the way through to that bottom method there, which is actually us asking more specifics on energy supplies. So whether you have a 100% renewable tariff at home, what kind of energy you use to heat the space in which you work, whether that's gas, electricity, oil, and all sorts of questions like that. Next slide, please. And yeah, that's what got us to our methodology, which is a survey we send out to as many people as we can to get to fill it in. And it's a series of multiple choice questions. So we tend to get quite a good response rate, which is great. And none of the questions are on the invasive side at all. So certainly people are happy to fill in those questions. And all of the responses allow us to estimate the total energy per person and then sort of convert that into emissions at the organization level. Next slide, please. So I guess now we're delving into the interesting part of what I came to speak about today, which is the results of all this work we've done and all the data we've collated. And just as a bit of context to the data, we've now got around 10,000 individual responses across 4 years since we first started measuring. So that's covering 2019, which is that more business as usual scenario where most people were commuting into the office as the norm, but there was the occasional small company or organization where home working was practiced, right the way through to 2020, where hybrid working is more so the norm now, and most organizations have a mixture of home and office working within the day-to-day practices. And from this database, we've come up with an average emissions per person, and this is sitting at 2.5 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent gases per day worked from home. And really putting this back into the context of your commute, this is equivalent to driving 11 kilometers by the average diesel car. So if you do drive to work and you know your journey to and from work is over this 11 kilometers, then you can already really begin to picture how your commute may be leading to more emissions than if you were working from home. And apart from emissions, our results have actually enabled us to get some really interesting behavioral insights as well from all the multiple choice questions asked. And our general findings, you can see some key hitters in the table on the slide here. But in general, we have found that a lot of people have been increasingly energy efficient at home, with 6% of people in 2019 having 100% renewable tariffs, moving right the way up to 20% in 2022. And those with LED lighting going from 27% to 44% between 2019 and 2022. And we've also seen some interesting heating insights, such as the move to more electric-based heating systems, and also the awareness, probably mostly driven by the cost of living crisis, but sort of reducing energy from heating by just heating the room in which you're working in, rather than a couple of rooms or your whole flat or house. And going back to the kind of averages per day, we've seen a slight decrease in these averages since 2019. And then the last sort of area to hone in on is the fact that from all our findings, actually 2/3 of your impact or your emissions from home working will arise from your heating. So really the best way you can reduce your impact is to focus on your heating, how many hours you have your heating on for, whether you can turn down the temperature, how many rooms you heat, and if there is potential to move away from fossil fuel heating systems. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is my last slide, and where we really pull it back into that wider question of whether home working does reduce your carbon impact. And we found three main insights or trends that have tipped the balance between home working releasing more or less emissions than the traditional office-based working and commuting into your office. The first is your location. So we took a subset of our data specific to the UK and found out that home working is generally less emission intensive than office-based work. And this is because a lot of the offices and individuals within our sample were based in cities or in city suburbs or in slightly more rural locations, where employees often had to opt to drive to work and often over longer distances as well. And this is compared to our London subset of data, where most individuals can, and in fact do, get to work via public transport, cycling or walking, and over much shorter distances as well. So it's the shorter distances and the lower carbon commuting options that have really found going into your office space is actually likely to lead to less emissions than if you stayed at home and worked from home. And this led us to our second sort of insight, which is around the idea of tipping points in commuting, both in terms of the mode you might take, whether that's a private vehicle or public transport or any other mode available to you, and the distance of your journey as well. And you can see on the slide, we've pinpointed a few key tipping points for various modes. So for public transport, your commute can actually be a lot longer in terms of kilometers traveled before it starts leading to more emissions than if you were just staying at home and working from home. And just picking out an example, we could look at train. And if you take a train to work and your round journey is 50 kilometers, so 25 kilometers there and back, if you start going over that distance, that's where that tipping point tips working in your office and commuting into your office as being a larger carbon impact. And then the last sort of point to mention is that these are all annual average trends. And actually, as mentioned before, most of your impact sits in your heating. And again, these are concentrated in the winter months. So that 2.5 emissions average I mentioned before, actually can go more towards around 4 or 5 kilograms of carbon in winter, right the way down to 1 in summer. So in winter, and in most cases, if you're working from home and heating your own individual home, this will generate more emissions than if you were commuting into your office and having just that office space heated. But yes, that's all from me. Our findings will be, released soon. So if you wanted to learn a bit more, please do sign up to our newsletter. Thank you.